What was the Nye Committee? Right, it's a committee that investigated why did we enter World War I? And what they determined was we entered to save bankers and businesses who'd made all those loans to the English and the French, not to the Germans. Okay? So our friend Mr. Debs was right all along, even though he went to jail for his comment. What did the Washington Naval Conference do? Yeah, it was aimed at keeping the tonnage of ships down, the number of ships down. Was it aimed at limiting America's ships? British ships? Japan's ships, okay? So it did nothing to reduce the tonnage of American naval vessels or British naval vessels, etc. It was aimed at making sure Japan couldn't build up as big a navy. Japan signed the Washington Naval Agreement. Did they go along with it ultimately? No. Okay. But this, how does this break isolationism? Because we're getting involved politically with people. All right. What does the Kellogg-Briand Pact say? No war. We're going to outlaw war. It's a great sentiment. If I have a problem with Alex's country, I'm not going to go in and attack him and beat him up. I'm going to sit down at the negotiations table and say, Alex, we have a problem. Let's work it out. Okay? If only people were so reasonable. National Origins Act, what did it do? Immigration restriction. Since the 1880s, Americans have been asking for immigration restriction. Laborers, unions, etc. Okay? Progressives wanted labor or immigration restriction for a couple of reasons. First of all, it would improve maybe life for laborers. It would help maybe get rid of so many slums, all those kinds of things. So the National Origins Act sets a quota. And it sets the quotas based on how many people from your country were in this country earlier in the 1860s. So who does it really discriminate against? People from Eastern and Southern Europe, because they have very few people here in 1860, whereas most of them come by 1890. So all the Englishmen in the world could enter in. It was the people from Russia who were restricted from entering. Okay? So we begin to see in the 1920s fewer people being able to immigrate into this country, which has a kind of positive effect in the beginning economically, in that laborers or workers do not worry as much about their jobs because there isn't that huge pool of immigrants to steal their job. Okay? 1920s KKK. Why, against whom, greatest priority when revived? Okay, so the KKK usually shows up in the woodwork when things are not good economically. And you say to yourself, haha, Miss Roberts, things were very good in the 1920s economically. Well, that's true for a portion of the population. But there are a lot of people that were very marginal in the 20s and barely making it. Remember, still in 1920, 50% of Americans were farmers or dependent upon farmers for their income. So their income is going to be very limited. There were industries which were in trouble by 1926, 27. How many more cars did we really need in America? Not many, because anybody who could afford a car already had a car. So when you can no longer need to build as many cars, it takes away jobs at the Ford Motor Company, but it also takes away jobs at U.S. Steel, which is making the steel for that car, at Goodyear, which is making the tires for that car, at Goodyear for making the hoses that go in that car to run all the parts, etc. Okay? Standard Oil maybe needs to drill fewer wells, refine less oil because there's not as many cars using gasoline, etc. So the KKK and those kinds of groups tend to come out of the woodwork when people feel threatened economically. And in the 1920s, lower class whites were threatened economically because they were having a hard time making it because they were farmers or they were laborers, whatever. Who are they against in the 1920s? Are they against blacks still? Yes. They're still on the hit list. But now we add to that hit list people who are Jewish, people who are Catholic, people who are immigrants. Well, almost all immigrants in the 1920s were Jewish or Catholic. They were coming from Eastern Europe before that. Okay? Where does it start in the 1920s? In like southern Indiana, which is, you know, pretty poor area of the country. A lot of mining and poor farming. Okay? Why does it not take off? And then remember the leader gets arrested for he wants to have sex with his secretary or one of the girls in the office, and she turns him down, so he drugs her and transports her by railroad car across state lines, and he gets arrested, and so there's this big black mark on the KKK. But then also in 1929 the stock market crashes, and in really, really bad economic times, who do you blame for things? Can you blame that immigrant, that black guy, that, you know, etc.? Probably not as much. Even though we're seeing, I would guess if you could find out the statistics, I would bet there's an upsurge right now in KKK membership. There certainly is an upsurge in some of those Aryan brother groups and things like that. Sacco and Vanzetti case showed what? A fear of radical immigrants. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italians who supposedly robbed a payroll master and shot him, and this is in Massachusetts. They were both found guilty, though historians really think only one of them was. They were sentenced to death. The judge at the trial showed his prejudice against them by calling them those anarchist bastards, quote unquote. I think they were some of the first people electrocuted in America. And the choir kids last period told me that when they were in Boston, they saw the place where they were electrocuted, and it's now a hospital, which is kind of ironic. Harlem Renaissance, who, what, why ended. Harlem Renaissance was kind of the birth of black arts in America, especially in New York area in the 1920s, painting, literature, and jazz. So it really brings jazz to the forefront as an American form of music and something to be celebrated. The sad thing is the musicians were black, but only whites could go into jazz clubs usually. Black artists and black writers were really dependent upon whites to be their patrons, and Langston Hughes found out as long as he wrote about the soul of Africa beating in my heart, that his patron paid his bills. The minute he wrote Life is Crappy in America for a black man, she dropped him. Langston Hughes, the quote is, "I am black, I am beautiful," which actually comes out of the Old Testament in Psalm of Psalms. Comes from there. The other important African American, if you will, in the 1920s is a guy named Marcus Garvey, who started an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which advocated back to Africa, that blacks should pick themselves up and go back to Africa to their roots. He didn't get a lot of takers because most people didn't have the money for that. Plus, do you really want to go back to a place where you don't speak the language? Okay. Like some of my ancestors, part of my ancestry is German. Do I want to go back to Germany and live? I speak no German, and I hate bratwurst and beer. So I think I'll pass. What, Chris? Why were writers disillusioned in the 1920s? Because of the horrors of World War I. They were so turned off by man's inhumanity to man during the war. Things like the charge across no man's land when, you know, the new machine gun things would just mow everybody down. The millions and millions of deaths. They were referred to sometimes as the lost generation. You might want to remember that term in regard to the writers of that time period. Babbitt and Main Street, written by Sinclair Lewis, criticized what? Middle class and their values. The idea of keeping up with the Joneses. It's not enough to live in a nice house. I have to have a new car. I have to have a new refrigerator. I have to have a fan. I have to have a new washing machine. All of those kinds of things.